The mysterious tenant in apartment 306. Lena took a deep breath as she stepped into the building's lobby, the weight of her suitcase dragging slightly behind her. The air inside was thick, a mix of old varnish, dust, and something faintly metallic. It was an old apartment complex, but the price was unbeatable for a city this expensive. The landlord, Mr. Gavrilov, was a wiry man in his late 50s, with sunken cheeks and a nervous energy about him. He handed her the keys with a stiff, uneasy smile. "Quiet place. You'll like it," he said, his fingers lingering on the keys a second too long before letting go. Lena nodded, but as she climbed the stairs to the third floor, she couldn't shake the odd feeling that had settled in her chest the moment she walked in. The third floor. The hallway stretched out ahead of her, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs. The walls were a dull beige, cracked in places, and the doors were numbered in peeling brass plaques. Her apartment, 302, was near the middle of the hallway. As she passed each door, she noticed small details. 303 had a deep scratch running across the wood, as if someone had dragged something heavy against it. 304 had a doormat that looked newer than the others. 305 had 3 locks, all bolted shut. Then she reached 306. She stopped. Something about this door felt wrong. Unlike the others, it had no peephole, no welcome mat, no signs of life. Instead of a brass number plaque, there was a rusted metal plate bolted over where 306 inches should be. A strange humming sound came from inside. Low, almost like an appliance running. But there was something off about it. It wasn't rhythmic. It wasn't normal. She hesitated for a second longer before brushing it off. Not my business. Lena turned the key to her new home, stepped inside, and locked the door behind her. The first night, Lena spent the evening unpacking, trying to settle in. The apartment was quiet, almost too quiet. Outside, no street noise made its way up. The walls were thick, the building old enough to muffle sounds. Still, as she lay in bed later that night, she could swear she heard something. Not from the hallway. Not from the apartment next door. From 306. A faint shuffling sound, followed by a long, slow creak, like a chair being dragged across the floor. Lena sat up, heart pounding. She waited. Listened. Silence. Maybe it was just her imagination. Maybe the old pipes were settling. Maybe she was just tired. Convincing herself of that, she lay back down. Just as she was drifting off to sleep, a soft tap, tap, tap echoed from her wall. Not random, not the sound of pipes, a deliberate knock. And it was coming from inside apartment 306. Part 2. The door that shouldn't be there. Lena had always been practical. She didn't believe in ghost stories, urban legends, or bad omens. But something about apartment 306 made her pause. Unlike the other doors, which were scuffed and dented from years of tenants moving in and out, 306 looked untouched, as if no one had passed through it in decades. The number plate was rusted, barely legible, and where there should have been a peephole, there was only an empty hole, as if the glass had been punched out long ago. She didn't realize she was staring until a voice snapped her out of it. "You're the new tenant." Lena turned sharply. An elderly woman stood by the door of 308, her sharp gray eyes watching Lena closely. She wore a dark floral dress, and her thin fingers clutched the edge of the doorframe. Yeah, I just moved in." The woman nodded slowly, gaze flickering to 306 for a brief moment before she muttered, "Keep to yourself, dear." Then, without another word, she shut the door with a soft click. Lena hesitated but shrugged it off. Maybe the woman was just eccentric. Every building had at least one. That night, after hours of unpacking, she finally collapsed onto her mattress, exhausted. The building was mostly silent, except for the occasional creak of old pipes and a distant television murmuring from somewhere down the hall. Just as she was about to drift off, a sound, a sharp scraping noise, like a chair being dragged across a wooden floor. Lena blinked, suddenly wide awake. It was coming from apartment 306. She sat up, heart hammering. Maybe it was just the pipes, she reasoned. Or maybe the neighbors were moving furniture. But then came another sound, a single, deliberate knock. 3 slow raps against wood. Knock, knock, knock. Lena held her breath, staring at her bedroom door. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside the wall, right behind her headboard. Part 3. Strange Occurrences. Lena stood there for a moment, staring at the old woman's closed door. Something about her tone, the way her eyes darted toward 306, sent a chill down Lena's spine. Brushing off the feeling, she turned away and entered her own apartment. 302 was small but comfortable, exactly what she needed. The moving boxes were still piled up, but after a long day, all she wanted was to shower and sleep. That night, as she lay in bed, a faint scraping sound pulled her from the edge of sleep. At first, she thought it was coming from inside her apartment, maybe a loose pipe or the wind rattling the window. But as she listened, heart pounding, she realized it was coming from the hallway, a long, slow dragging sound, like furniture being scraped across the floor. Lena sat up, straining to hear. It stopped suddenly. Silence. She held her breath. Then a faint knock. Not on her door, on 306. Lena's blood ran cold. She waited, expecting to hear footsteps, a door opening, something. But there was nothing, just silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she forced herself to lie back down, convincing herself it was just her imagination. But deep down, she knew someone or something was inside apartment 306. Part 4. The knock at 306. Lena gripped the blanket tighter, her breath shallow. The hallway was silent, now too silent. Whoever had knocked hadn't left. She hesitated before slipping out of bed, moving quietly toward her apartment door. Pressing her ear against the wood, she listened. Nothing. She exhaled, feeling silly for overreacting. Old buildings creak, pipes groan, neighbors knock on the wrong doors. It's nothing. Still, curiosity gnawed at her. She unlocked her door just a crack and peeked into the hallway. The dim light flickered. 306 quote. Its door stood exactly as before, shut, motionless. But something was different. On the floor in front of the door, there was a piece of paper. Lena hesitated. No one was there, and she hadn't heard footsteps leaving. Slowly, she stepped out and bent down to pick it up. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, as if it had been sitting there for years. A single sentence was scrawled in shaky, uneven handwriting. Don't trust what you see. A chill crawled up Lena's spine. She turned sharply, expecting to see someone watching her, but the hallway was empty. She retreated quickly into her apartment, locking the door behind her. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she unfolded the note again, staring at the words. Who left it? What did it mean? And more importantly, why did it look like it had been written decades ago? Part 5. The mirror in 306. The next morning, Lena woke up to the feeling of unease still gnawing at her. The note sat on her kitchen counter, taunting her with its cryptic message. The idea that someone in the building had written it, or worse, that it was meant for her, stuck with her all day. She couldn't shake the image of the empty, peeling door of apartment 306. It haunted her thoughts like a shadow she couldn't escape. That afternoon, as she went out for coffee, Lena decided to take a walk around the building, hoping the fresh air would clear her head. She passed the front door and glanced over her shoulder toward 306 Dot. This time, she noticed something she hadn't before. A faint, almost imperceptible smudge on the glass of the door. A smear, like someone had pressed their hand against it. Dot. Her heart skipped. It was strange, given the door had looked completely untouched the night before. Curiosity burned hotter than ever. Who lives there? Why is no one talking about it? That evening, the sounds from 306 were louder than before. The dragging noise, followed by those deliberate knocks, 3 slow taps. Lena froze, heart in her throat. Dot. She knew what she had to do. Part 6. Breaking the silence. Lena couldn't help herself. The eerie sensation she'd felt since moving in, the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight, pushed her toward 306. That night, as the building fell into its usual silence, she grabbed the spare key she'd found hidden in a drawer left by the landlord and quietly walked down the hallway. Her steps were tentative, her breath quick and shallow. When she reached the door, she paused, staring at the faded number 306 inches that barely glinted under the dim hallway lights. The smudge on the glass stared back at her. She wiped it with her sleeve, no difference. The glass was just as blurred as before. With trembling hands, she slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door clicked open. Lena Quote's breath caught. No turning back now. She stepped inside, holding her breath as the door creaked, shutting softly behind her. The apartment was dark, too dark for a place that should have had some life. A musty smell filled the air, something like rotting wood and stale air. She turned on the lights. The apartment looked abandoned, old furniture covered in dusty sheets, cobwebs hanging in the corners, the floor creaking with every step. There was nothing unusual at first glance. But then, in the far corner of the room, something caught her eye. A mirror. It was large, ancient, almost as if it didn't belong in the space. It leaned against the wall, its glass cracked but strangely unbroken. As Lena approached, she felt a sudden chill. Her heartbeat quickened. Her reflection, distorted, blurry, like the mirror was trying to hide her face, seemed to smile back at her, though her lips didn't move. Suddenly, the air in the room felt dense, unnaturally heavy. The lights flickered once more, and when they came back on, the reflection wasn't hers anymore. It was someone else. A woman with dark, hollow eyes and a hollow smile, staring back from the mirror. Lena took a step back, but her feet felt frozen. The woman's smile grew wider, unnaturally wide, and her lips barely moved as she whispered, "You shouldn't have come in." Lena stumbled back, her heart racing in her chest. She turned to run, but the door was gone. There was no exit, no way out. The woman in the mirror's voice echoed in the room. "You're trapped here now." Part 7. The Room That Never Ends. Lena's pulse pounded in her ears as she turned in frantic circles, her breath quick and shallow. The door, the one she had entered through, was gone, replaced by nothing but the same cracked walls and shadows that seemed to twist in unnatural ways. Her hands trembled as she touched the smooth surface where the door had been, hoping for some sign that it was still there. But there was nothing. She looked back at the mirror. The woman's eyes, black, lifeless, empty, were locked onto hers. The smile widened ever so slightly, but this time, Lena could hear it more clearly. "You're not leaving." The voice echoed in the room, like a whisper that surrounded her, pressing against her skull. Lena stumbled backward, shaking her head, desperate to find an exit. No. This is just a dream. This is some kind of trick. Don't you see? The woman's voice came again, stronger this time, closer. "You belong here now." Lena's eyes darted around the room, looking for anything that could make sense of the nightmare she found herself in. Her gaze landed on the floor. The once dull wood now seemed to shift, as if the room itself was breathing. Without thinking, she dropped to her knees, reaching for the floorboards. There had to be something. A way out, As she pried at a loose board, her fingers grazed something cold, something metallic. Her heart raced as she pulled up a hidden latch, revealing a narrow, dark passageway that seemed to go downward. A feeling of dread washed over her, but Lena's need to escape was stronger. She climbed into the passage, crawling through the narrow tunnel, the air growing colder with every inch she moved forward. Then, a sound footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed behind her. She froze. They were following her. The woman, she could feel her presence, like a shadow looming just behind her. Lena crawled faster, her hands slipping on the cold stone walls of the tunnel, but she refused to look back. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The mirror. The room. It's all a trap. Lena's mind raced. She had to get out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she saw a faint light ahead. She pushed forward with all her strength, her body aching, but her determination keeping her moving. And then she broke through. Lena tumbled into a new room, bare, cold, and unfamiliar. But this one wasn't like the apartment. It was a dark, empty space, with walls that seemed to stretch on forever, as if they didn't end. Her breath caught as she stood up, looking around in confusion. This place felt wrong. There was a faint glow in the distance, just out of reach, and the air was so thick that it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. Before she could move toward the light, the ground beneath her feet shifted. The mirror. It was there again, standing tall at the far side of the room. Its cracked surface reflected nothing but a void, a swirling blackness that seemed to swallow the light around it. Lena's pulse hammered in her chest. The woman's voice, distorted, barely a whisper, drifted toward her from the depths of the mirror. "You should have stayed away." Lena stumbled back. No, this can't be happening. This has to be a nightmare. But the mirror, it was pulling her in. The reflection of Lena in the mirror began to change. Her face twisted, stretched, not her own, becoming something else, something dark and unfamiliar. The woman's smile filled the glass, growing wider as if the reflection were reaching out toward her. "You've been here before," the woman hissed, her voice now booming in the empty room. "You never left," Lena screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the walls, by the room, by the mirror. She reached for the wall, for the light, but her fingers passed straight through it, as if the very air had turned to stone. And then she felt it, the pull, the mirror's power, pulling at her, dragging her closer, sucking her into the darkness, into the void where time and space didn't exist. Just as her hand brushed the surface of the mirror, the woman's voice erupted into an agonizing scream, a scream that echoed in every corner of the room, shaking the very foundations of the space around her. Lena closed her eyes. She could feel the cold, the suffocating pull of the darkness. And then nothing. Part 8. The final revelation. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the smiling face in the mirror grew more grotesque with every passing second. It wasn't her. It couldn't be. Her reflection twisted, contorted, like it was trying to crawl out of the mirror and into the room with her. Her reflection's smile stretched wider, until its jaw seemed to unhinge in an unnatural, bone-cracking way. "You should have stayed away," the voice rasped again, this time closer, colder, like ice cutting through her skin. Lena backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. But the more she moved, the more the room seemed to stretch, like it was closing in around her, trapping her in its grasp. The walls were breathing slow, rhythmic, like the room had a pulse of its own. "You belong to us now," the reflection whispered. It wasn't even speaking to Lena anymore. It was speaking through her. Her eyes widened as the mirror's surface began to warp, the cracks spreading outward like spiderwebs. And from within, something began to move. A hand, pale, bony, long-fingered, slid out of the mirror's surface, the fingers stretching unnaturally, scraping against the edges of the frame. The hand seemed to drag the rest of the figure along, pulling its twisted body inch by inch into the room. Lena gasped, stumbling backward, but her legs felt like lead. She was paralyzed, frozen in place, as the woman from the mirror emerged fully, stepping into the room with a sickening crackle of shifting bones. She was horrific. Her skin stretched tight over a skeletal frame, her eyes hollow like empty pits of darkness. Her mouth opened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long. "This is your fate," the woman hissed, her voice echoing off the walls, growing louder, more distorted. Lena wanted to scream, to run, but the room seemed to pull her in, like gravity itself was being manipulated. The walls closed in tighter, and the woman reached for her with fingers that slithered across the air like serpents. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. For one moment, nothing moved. The mirror, the woman, everything stopped. Lena's chest tightened as she realized she was standing in the eye of a storm. But she didn't have much time. With a final, desperate surge of will, Lena lunged forward, grabbing a broken piece of wood from the floor. She swung it at the woman, but it passed straight through her. The woman let out a screech, and the room seemed to shudder violently, as if it were coming apart. The walls vibrated, the air became thick with static, and the lights flickered violently. The mirror cracked open. A void. A swirling, endless darkness that threatened to consume everything in sight. It called to her, an abyss that seemed to pull at her very soul. Lena stumbled backward, her heart pounding, every instinct screaming at her to run. But the woman was there, her skeletal fingers grabbing at the air, pulling herself forward, closer still. Lena could feel the cold emanating from her, creeping into her skin. Her mind raced. There was no escape. There was no way out of this room. Then, like a flash of lightning, a thought struck her. The note. The warning, the cryptic message. "Don't trust what you see." Lena's eyes darted back to the mirror. She could barely make out her reflection now, as the woman's form began to merge with hers, the blackness of the void creeping into her own image. It was a reflection of her own face, distorted and twisted, no longer her own, like the darkness had been trying to take her this whole time. In that moment, Lena understood. The mirror wasn't just a reflection, it was a door to this place, to this fate. She took a deep breath, and in one single, terrifying motion, she turned away from the mirror. She didn't look back. With every ounce of strength left in her, she ran blindly, her feet slamming against the floor, the cold air biting at her skin, the woman's laugh ringing in her ears like a death knell. The room stretched endlessly, but there was the door, the entrance, standing like a mirage in the distance. She sprinted. Her hands grasped the handle, but before she could pull the door open, the woman's voice shrieked, a violent, spine-chilling scream that shook the very foundation of the room. "You can't leave!" Lena yanked the door, throwing it open with all her might, and as she stepped through, she slammed it shut behind her. Everything stopped. The room fell silent, but Lena's heart didn't stop racing. She was back. Apartment 306. But this time, it was different. The door was gone, replaced by an empty wall. No sign of the mirror, no sign of the woman, no indication of anything that had happened. Everything was exactly the same. Except for one thing. The note. It was back, lying on the floor in front of her, just as it had been the first time. But this time, there were more words.
"You're still here." Lena turned slowly, her eyes wide with terror. Her reflection, her true reflection, was standing in the mirror. And this time, it was smiling back.
"You're still here." Lena turned slowly, her eyes wide with terror. Her reflection, her true reflection, was standing in the mirror. And this time, it was smiling back.